1944, a year when the world shook beneath the roar of engines, the crack of artillery, and the suffocating weight of uncertainty. Europe was burning. The skies above it, once symbols of freedom and peaceful flight, had transformed into brutal battlegrounds where technology raced against time, and desperation carved the future of aviation. It was in these unforgiving skies that Germany unveiled one of the most bizarre, terrifying, and tragically flawed machines ever unleashed in the name of warfare, the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet. Picture the scene: a dim, smoke-stained hangar at dawn. Mechanics shuffle around a tiny, rocket-powered triangle of metal that hisses like an angry beast. The air smells of fuel so volatile that a single drop could melt through human skin. Pilots, young, pale, exhausted, watch the aircraft with a mix of awe and dread. They know what this machine promises: blistering speed, electrifying climbs, and a climb rate no Allied plane could dream of matching. But they also know what it demands: a gamble with physics, with chemistry, and with their own survival. Outside, the sky is already trembling under the distant rumble of American bombers, massive silver fortresses drifting steadily toward German cities. This is the comet's purpose. This is why it exists: to soar upward like a startled meteor, tear through bomber formations, and then glide back to Earth with nothing but hope guiding its wings. But as the canopy closes and the rocket engine ignites, the truth becomes painfully clear. The Me 163 isn't just a weapon of innovation. It is a desperate experiment, a technological gamble pushed far beyond the edge of practicality and safety. And in the chaos of 1944, this gamble would become the defining tragedy of one of WWII's most misunderstood aircraft. The Me 163 Komet was born from a desperate dream: to outrun the enemy. But to understand how that dream took shape, you must step into the suffocating atmosphere of late-war Germany, a country battered by relentless bombings, drained of resources, and racing against a clock it had already lost. The skies above the fatherland had become highways for unending streams of Allied bombers, massive metal giants that drifted calmly toward their targets while unleashing destruction city after city. Every morning, the wailing of air raid sirens blended with the distant hum of thousands of engines, creating an eerie, familiar soundtrack that echoed across towns, forests, and shattered concrete. And in this grim landscape, where hope shrank with every passing month, German engineers pushed themselves beyond reason, searching for miracles in metal and fire. Their answer was the Me 163 Komet, a machine so radical, so violently different from every aircraft before it, that it felt less like a fighter plane and more like a fragment of science fiction hurled into the real world. At first glance, the Komet was deceptively small, almost fragile. Its wings were short and swept, its fuselage sharp and compact, its shape reminiscent of a deadly bird carved from steel. Yet it was what lay inside that turned it into something terrifying: a rocket engine capable of producing a blast of raw thrust unlike anything humanity had ever strapped to a manned aircraft. The heart of the Komet was a furious, explosive firestorm, a chemical monster that roared to life with a sound no piston engine could ever match. When ignited, it didn't climb toward the sky, it launched toward it, hurtling forward with the violent urgency of a meteor ripped from the earth. For the pilots chosen to fly it, this speed was both a dream and a death sentence. Training offered little preparation for what awaited them, because no simulator, no classroom, and no lecture could replicate the sensation of being slammed forward with such force that the world blurred into streaks of color. The moment the engine ignited, the Me 163 kicked its pilot back into the seat with crushing acceleration. In just a handful of seconds, it broke through speeds that most aircraft needed minutes to reach. The climb rate was equally shocking, straight upward like a lightning bolt tearing into the heavens. Most fighters of the time struggled above 25,000 feet. The Komet could blast past that altitude before many pilots even completed their first turn. But with such breathtaking performance came equally breathtaking danger. The aircraft burned through its precious fuel in an incredibly short span of time, less than 8 minutes at full throttle. Those 8 minutes, however, were more than enough to determine the fate of every mission. A Komet pilot had no gradual lead-in, no gentle climb, no chance to circle, observe, and adjust. When the aircraft was released and its rocket burst to life, the pilot had mere seconds to spot incoming bombers, choose a target, aim, and fire. There was no room for hesitation, no space for second chances. Every decision had to be instantaneous, instinctive, and executed while the cockpit vibrated violently under the overwhelming strain of sheer rocket power. The moment the fuel ran out, the Komet transformed into an entirely different machine. The furious roar faded into silence, and the once unstoppable rocket became a powerless glider, coasting through the sky with nothing but momentum to carry it. This was the moment when the aircraft's greatest strength became its greatest weakness. Allied pilots quickly learned that a comet at full power was nearly impossible to intercept. It moved too fast, climbed too steeply, and attacked with the speed of a thunderclap. But once the rocket burned dry, the comet became helpless. It could not accelerate, it could not climb, it could not escape. It simply drifted downward, exposed to gunfire from any angle, relying entirely on luck, gravity, and the pilot's skill to survive. Inside the cockpit, this transformation was terrifying. One moment, the control stick fought the pilot's grip as the rocket engine thundered behind him, rattling the entire airframe like an unchained beast. The next moment, silence fell, an eerie, unnatural silence that made the pilot suddenly aware of every creak, every groan, every tremor within the machine. The once roaring fighter now floated through the heavens like a wounded bird, its glide path predictable, its options limited. The pilot could only hope that he had enough altitude to escape the swarming fighters behind him, fighters that had been waiting patiently for this very moment. What made the situation even more fragile was the Comet's extremely unstable handling at lower speeds. Fast aircraft are graceful when fast, but unpredictable when slow. And the Komet was no exception. It was designed for blistering velocity, not gentle landings. Every glide was a gamble. Every turn had to be carefully calculated. A slight overcorrection could throw the plane off balance, a poorly timed maneuver could send it spiraling. Pilots often described the aircraft as alive, not in the sense of being helpful or responsive, but in the sense of being temperamental, moody, and unforgiving. One wrong movement, one minor misjudgment, and the Komet would fight back, not with warning lights or vibrations, but with catastrophic loss of control. Even when everything went right, even when the takeoff was flawless, the climb perfect, the attack precise, and the glide smooth, danger still lurked in the simplest part of flight, the landing. The Me-163 had no landing gear in the traditional sense. It took off on a detachable dolly, which was dropped moments after liftoff, and it landed on a wooden skid mounted under the fuselage. This made landings exceptionally risky. If the pilot misjudged the angle or speed, if the ground was uneven, if the skid struck too hard, or if debris littered the runway, the aircraft could shatter upon impact. Many Komets, even after successful missions, ended their flights in broken heaps of metal, leaving their pilots injured, or worse. Yet for all its flaws, for all its instability, for all its deadly quirks, the Komet represented something powerful, the desperate human desire to overcome limitations. The engineers who built it were not fools, nor were they blinded by fantasy. They were pushed by the crushing pressure of war, forced to chase ideas that normal circumstances would have abandoned. They experimented with prototypes that had no precedent. They dared to imagine aircraft propelled not by propellers or pistons but by raw chemical fury. And in doing so, they created a flying paradox, an aircraft that could reach the future, but only for a moment, before collapsing back into the tragic reality of its own design. For the ground crews who tended to the Komet, the experience was equally intense. They watched the aircraft sit quietly at dawn, dew collecting on its angular frame, giving no hint of the explosive force tucked inside. They listened to pilots speak in hushed tones, each man aware that he might not return. And they stood in tense silence as the rocket engine ignited, unleashing a white-hot plume of exhaust that scorched the concrete and rattled nearby equipment. They would stare upward as the small silhouette shot toward the clouds with unnatural speed, disappearing from view in seconds. But they also knew the ugly truth, that some of those pilots would return not as landing aircraft but as streams of trailing smoke, spiraling downward toward the far edge of the airfield. And still, despite all the danger, despite all the failures, despite its impossibly short range and catastrophic design flaws, the Me-163 Komet captured imaginations. It was a glimpse of a world that did not yet exist. A world where aviation defied the boundaries of the present. A world where aircraft soared faster, higher, and more aggressively than anyone had ever believed possible. But that glimpse came wrapped in tragedy. For every pilot who survived, another paid the ultimate price. For every successful flight, there were accidents, explosions, crashes, and losses that carved themselves into the memories of those who had witnessed them. The Me-163 was an idea too ambitious for its time, a machine built on the edge of human understanding. It was fast, so fast it rewrote the rules of aerial combat. But speed alone could not save it. Speed alone could not make it practical. And speed alone could not turn a brilliant concept into an effective weapon. What it achieved in sheer velocity, it lost in survivability, consistency, and strategy. In the end, the Komet became a symbol of the dangerous gap between innovation and reality, a reminder that even the most advanced technologies can become tragic failures when pushed beyond the boundaries of reason. The Komet's fuel was a nightmare, two hyper-reactive liquids that could dissolve flesh in seconds and explode from the slightest contamination. To understand the horror that came with flying the Me-163, you must imagine what it felt like to stand beside this aircraft long before the engine ever ignited. The air around it was thick with a chemical scent that stung the eyes and clung to the skin. The ground crew wore heavy protective suits, their faces hidden behind glass visors, moving slowly and carefully like surgeons preparing for a life-or-death operation. And in a way, they were. Every step mattered. Every motion had to be exact. One slip, one accidental spill, one drop of the wrong liquid landing on the wrong surface, and the result could be catastrophic. The Me-163 used two fuels, T-Stoff and C-Stoff. Their names sounded harmless, almost clinical, but these were mixtures so unstable that even storing them was a constant risk. T-Stoff was a highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide solution, something you were never meant to touch or breathe or even be near without layers of protection. It was corrosive beyond imagination. A splash on exposed skin didn't burn, it destroyed. Clothing dissolved. Flesh blistered and vanished. Bones cracked under chemical assault. And C-Stoff was even worse in its own way. It was a blend of hydrazine and methanol, a fuel so reactive that when it met T-Stoff, the two substances combined in an explosive reaction violent enough to tear apart a plane, a pilot, and anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby. Together, they created the volatile rocket thrust that powered the Komet, and the deadly danger that haunted everyone who touched it. This wasn't an engine you could simply start and stop. It didn't hum or roar like a traditional aircraft. It hissed, it boiled, it churned with furious chemical chaos. Before every mission, the ground crews filled the tanks with extreme caution. Each man carried the weight of knowing that a small procedural mistake could kill not only himself but the pilot and anyone within a dozen meters. The fueling hoses were long and reinforced. The protective clothing was so heavy and awkward that the men inside often felt claustrophobic. Yet even these measures weren't enough. Accidents happened. Tanks leaked. Valves stuck. Chemical fumes rose unexpectedly, burning lungs and skin and eyes. Every fueling operation felt like walking along the edge of a cliff in total darkness. For the pilot, the nightmare was even greater. He sat inside a cockpit surrounded by tanks of these fuels, sealed in a cramped space where the thin metal walls separated him from chemicals that could kill him without fire, without smoke, without even a chance to escape. The moment the canopy closed, he was trapped inside a flying bomb. Pilots sometimes compared the experience to being buried alive in a coffin filled with explosives. If a single seal failed, if a pipe ruptured, if a small mechanical defect let even a few drops leak into the cockpit, the fumes could kill him before he ever left the runway. Some pilots died not from crashes or enemy bullets but from fuel vapors silently creeping into their breathing space. They convulsed. They suffocated. They died in agony without ever seeing the sky. And this was before the aircraft even started moving. Once the Komet fired its propulsion system, the risk multiplied. The engine was so incredibly powerful, so intensely reactive, that even slight impurities or minor mechanical imperfections could trigger catastrophic explosions. These explosions were not cinematic fireballs, they were violent chemical implosions that tore aircraft apart instantly, leaving only fragments scattered across runways and fields. There were stories of pilots who didn't survive long enough to retract their landing skid. Their aircraft simply vanished into a blinding flash the moment the rocket chamber ignited. The remains of the cockpit were sometimes found hundreds of meters away, twisted beyond recognition. The pilots themselves, often there was nothing left to find. Even takeoff was a moment of raw terror. Unlike most fighters, the Komet didn't roll gracefully along the runway. It lurched forward under a blast of rocket thrust that slammed the pilot backward and caused the aircraft to skip, bounce, and scrape dangerously close to the ground before gaining stability. The takeoff dolly, a metal frame that supported the aircraft's wheels, was designed to drop away once airborne. Sometimes it didn't. When that happened, the aircraft became impossible to control. The dolly rattled, shook, and tore at the underside of the fuselage. Pilots were forced to abort, hit the ground too fast, and crash violently. Some survived these impacts. Many did not. And yet, strangely, takeoff was still safer than landing. Landing a Komet was often described as controlled chaos, though it was rarely controlled. With no fuel left, the pilot had only one chance. One approach. One glide path. No ability to climb again. No ability to circle around for another pass. He descended toward the landing strip with enemy fighters sometimes still diving at him, bullets shredding the air around the cockpit. And the airfield wasn't always clear. Debris, bomb craters, burn marks, equipment left behind in haste. Anything could ruin a landing. And ruin meant death. The aircraft touched down not on wheels but on a skid, an unforgiving piece of wood bolted to the belly. If the aircraft came down too hard, the skid could break, causing the Komet to flip violently. If the runway was uneven, the impact could shatter the airframe, fold the wings, or crack the fuel tanks. Many pilots survived their attacks, survived their powerless glide home, survived enemy gunfire, only to die in the final seconds of returning to the ground. Ground crews watched these landings with clenched jaws because they knew exactly what might happen. They saw comets come in too fast, too steep, or too uneven. They saw undercarriages snap, wings shear, canopies shatter, and they saw chemical fuel tanks rupture, spilling T-stuff and C-stuff across dirt and grass, causing clouds of toxic vapor to rise around the crashing aircraft. A burning Komet wasn't like a normal aircraft fire. Water couldn't put it out. Fire extinguishers barely affected it. Sometimes the only option was to watch helplessly as the plane dissolved itself into a pool of bubbling, smoking, contaminated sludge. It wasn't rare. It wasn't occasional. It was regular, expected, terrifying. And still, pilots volunteered to fly it. This is one of the most haunting aspects of the Me-163's story. The men who strapped themselves inside these machines knew the risks. They understood the statistics, the crashes, the explosions, the silent deaths from chemical exposure. They knew that flying a Komet meant accepting the very real possibility that they would never come home, even if no enemy ever fired a single shot at them. And yet they flew, driven by patriotism, by desperation, by duty, or perhaps by the strange mixture of thrill and horror that comes from piloting a machine so powerful that it felt like touching the edge of the impossible. But the fuel wasn't just deadly to those flying the aircraft, it was deadly to those who prepared it. Ground crew deaths were tragically common. Accidental spills left men screaming as their skin dissolved. Fuel leaks burned through boots, gloves, and equipment. Tanks sometimes ruptured during handling, sending streams of T-stuff hissing across the ground. Men who slipped or stumbled during fueling operations were sometimes drenched in chemicals that killed them before help could arrive. Flame didn't always follow these accidents. Sometimes the victims died without fire, without smoke, without an explosion. They simply dissolved in silence. There was no glamour in these moments. No glory, no heroic music, only human beings fighting to keep a dangerous machine operational, knowing that every time they touched it, they risked not their careers, not their pride, but their lives. The pilots feared the chemicals too, not just because of their destructive nature but because of the way they reacted inside the cockpit. There were instances where T-stuff leaked through damaged pipes and pooled beneath the pilot's seat. The chemical would eat through the metal floor as if it were made of paper. Sometimes pilots felt a burning sensation on their boots during flight, an unmistakable warning that the fuel had found its way into the cockpit. They had only seconds to act. If they closed the throttle and attempted to land immediately, they might survive. But if too much fuel leaked, their entire lower body could be destroyed before the aircraft even reached the ground. And yet, the Me-163 was trusted to intercept American bombers, giant steel fortresses defended by dozens of guns, planes that could survive hits, shrug off damage, and still return fire. The Komet flew faster than any fighter, but it was also more fragile than any of them. A bullet puncturing the wrong fuel line could create an instant flying tomb. One tracer round igniting the chemical mixture would vaporize the aircraft in the sky. The very thing that made the Comet so astonishing, its rocket engine, was also the thing that made it horrifyingly suicidal. Frighteningly often, the Comet killed more of its own pilots than it killed enemy aircraft. It became a weapon of contradiction. Fast but doomed, futuristic but fatally flawed, powerful but uncontrollable. It was a machine designed to fight enemies but ended up fighting the men who flew it. A weapon meant to inspire terror in Allied bombers but instead inspired dread in German pilots who climbed inside its cockpit knowing full well that survival depended not just on skill but on luck, and not the kind of luck that pilots usually trusted, but luck against chemistry, physics, and flawed engineering. In the end, the Comet's most common victims were its own men. They died not in battle but in fueling stations, on runways, in accidental ignitions, and during catastrophic landings. The aircraft that promised a new era of speed instead delivered a new era of tragedy. Even in silence, even sitting cold on the ground, its presence created tension, fear, and caution among everyone around it. It was an aircraft that made the very air feel dangerous for all its failures. The Me-163 Comet was undeniably ahead of its time. Even in the midst of war, when practicality often outweighed ambition, the Comet's design whispered of a future that was yet to come. Its sleek, triangular wings, its rocket propulsion system, its ability to climb at an almost vertical angle, all of it looked like something out of a dream, a vision of a world where aircraft could move faster than the eye could follow, reach altitudes previously deemed impossible, and strike with sudden, devastating precision. There was a strange, almost magnetic beauty to it. When viewed from the ground, the Comet's silhouette seemed alien, an arrowhead ripped from the imagination of a science fiction writer and dropped onto a European airfield. Engineers, pilots, and even Allied observers alike were captivated. It represented the possibility of a future in which aviation would break free from the constraints of gravity, speed, and conventional design. But this vision arrived too late. By the time the Comet was operational, the war had already turned against Germany. Allied bombers flew over German cities with near impunity. Fighter aircraft such as the P-51 Mustang and the Spitfire had matured into highly reliable, highly lethal machines. These aircraft could be flown by men with less risk, could operate longer missions, and could absorb damage that would have destroyed a Comet. While the Comet could, in theory, climb faster and reach higher speeds, it could not sustain combat, it could not intercept enough bombers to change the course of the war, and it could not compensate for the staggering number of inexperienced pilots being pushed into service. In the race between innovation and survival, the Comet was tragically misaligned, brilliant in conception, yet crippled in execution. The aircraft's futuristic design also made it extremely difficult to maintain. Its rocket engine required precise handling, exacting chemical fueling, and constant monitoring. Even minor mechanical defects could result in failure, making each sortie a gamble. Pilots and ground crews alike faced the constant tension of knowing that one small error could be fatal. Unlike conventional fighters, which had redundant systems and could often limp home after damage, the Comet had no room for mistakes. One failed hydraulic valve, one cracked fuel line, one miscalculated landing, any of these could turn the aircraft into an instant death trap. And yet, despite the danger, there was a strange allure to flying it, a thrill born of pushing the boundaries of speed and physics. It was a glimpse of what flight could be, but one that was built on a foundation too fragile to endure. Even more tragically, the Comet's advanced technology highlighted the gap between vision and reality in wartime Germany. Its designers imagined aircraft capable of revolutionizing aerial combat, but they did not have the infrastructure, the resources, or the time to turn that vision into a weapon of sustained operational effectiveness. Factories were bombed, supply lines disrupted, and skilled labor was increasingly scarce. The Me-163, despite being a marvel of engineering, could not overcome these limitations. It became a symbol of a nation trying to do too much with too little, trying to innovate under circumstances that demanded reliability over imagination. For the men who flew it, for the engineers who built it, and for the strategists who deployed it, the Comet was a reminder that a brilliant machine alone cannot win a war. Timing, resources, and human endurance were just as crucial, and on all of these counts, the Comet arrived too late. Its operational history reflected this harsh reality. Flights were often short, dangerous, and rarely decisive. Even the most skilled pilots found themselves limited by the aircraft's fuel constraints, mechanical unreliability, and extreme fragility. While they could reach the bombers faster than any other German fighter, the attack window was tiny, and retreating after the strike was perilous. Many pilots never completed a mission, dying not from enemy fire but from the aircraft itself, exploding fuel, crashes, or failed landings. Those who survived were left with the psychological burden of having flown a machine that seemed to exist more for daring spectacle than for practical effectiveness. In this sense, the Comet's legacy was as much psychological as it was physical. It inspired awe, fear, and an unsettling respect for what could go wrong in an instant. Yet, despite all of its flaws, there was a certain poetry to the Me 163. It represented the intersection of human ambition and technological possibility. Every mission was a study in extremes: extreme speed, extreme altitude, extreme danger, extreme precision. The pilots who took to the sky with the Comet were not merely soldiers, they were explorers of a frontier that humanity had only glimpsed, testing limits that no one else had dared to approach. Watching a comet streak upward, the horizon blurring beneath it, the Earth falling away, one could glimpse what the future of aviation might hold, a future that was fast, powerful, and untethered from the limitations of piston engines and traditional aerodynamics. But this glimpse came at a steep cost, a reminder that the march of progress is rarely gentle or forgiving. The irony was palpable. The Comet was meant to strike terror into enemy bombers, to change the trajectory of battles, and perhaps even the war itself. Yet it achieved far more notoriety for its danger to its own pilots than for the destruction it inflicted. It was, in essence, a weapon whose greatest adversary was itself. Every takeoff, every climb, every glide back to the airfield was a struggle against the very forces the aircraft had been designed to harness. Speed, altitude, and firepower, the hallmarks of the Comet's design, became double-edged swords, dazzling in theory, lethal in practice. The aircraft had not failed because it lacked innovation, but because it demanded more from men, materials, and conditions than wartime Germany could reliably provide. And so the Me 163 became a symbol. It was a testament to human ingenuity and a cautionary tale of ambition untethered from practicality. It hinted at a future where pilots could defy conventional limits, yet it reminded everyone who flew, built, or observed it that even the most advanced machine could become a tragedy when pressed into service prematurely. It arrived too late to make a difference, too dangerous to be widely deployed, and too unreliable to inspire confidence beyond the thrill of its design. Its speed and technological innovation could not counterbalance its weaknesses, and in this, it captured the essence of wartime desperation, the pursuit of a miracle that came at a staggering human cost. Even today, when historians and aviation enthusiasts look back at the Me 163, it is impossible to ignore its contradictions. It is futuristic yet fragile, powerful yet impractical, awe-inspiring yet deadly. The aircraft stands as a stark reminder that technology alone cannot dictate outcomes, that innovation without reliability can be as dangerous as the enemy, and that timing is as important as design. In a world where survival often depends on predictability, consistency, and control, the Comet represented everything opposite: speed over stability, ambition over practicality, risk over safety. And in doing so, it cemented its place in history, not as the revolutionary weapon its creators imagined, but as a legend of what might have been, a glimpse of a future that arrived too broken, too late, and too dangerous to fulfill its promise. Its silhouette resting on an airfield at dusk tells the story even now. There it sits, quiet and still, wings sharp against the fading light, engine silent, fuel drained, and canopy empty. Engineers who once studied its every detail are long gone, pilots who once climbed inside its cockpit are long gone, yet the machine endures as a frozen vision of the edge of possibility. It reminds all who see it of the delicate balance between ambition and reality, innovation and practicality, courage and survival. The Me 163 Comet was a machine ahead of its time, a fighter that could have heralded the future of aviation, but its future came too late, and its lessons were written in tragedy.